welcome to the Virtual Memories Show. I'm your host, Gil Roth, and you're listening to a weekly podcast about books and life. Not necessarily in that order. You can subscribe to the Virtual Memories Show through iTunes, or by plugging our RSS feed into your favorite podcatcher. You can find the RSS feed on our websites, vmspod.com or chimeraobscura.com/vm. We're also on Twitter and Instagram at vmspod, at virtualmemoriespodcast.tumblr.com, and on Spotify, YouTube, and tunein.com by searching for Virtual Memories Show. And if you like this podcast, please go to the iTunes store, look up the Virtual Memories Show, and leave a rating and maybe a review for us. That'll inspire Apple to promote us a little. And of course, you can also promote us by telling people about the podcast on social media or however else you publicize the things you like. And if that's Facebook, I don't mind. Now, you can support the Virtual Memories Show and get access to exclusive content with a recurring monthly donation via Patreon. Just visit patreon.com/vmspod and set up your level of support. You'll get new material from our patron-only blog, and you'll also get to listen to my quarterly bonus podcast, Fear of a Square Planet, which features extra material from our guests and is only available to supporters of the show. So visit patreon.com/vmspod and help me continue to produce smart conversation about books, art, comics, and culture every week at the Virtual Memories Show. Well, the year's almost over, which makes it time for our 6th annual guest list episode, with a bonus conversation at the end. For the guest list, for those of you who are new to this, I asked the past year's podcast guests to tell us about the favorite book they read, in this case, 2018. It doesn't have to be something published in 2018, just something they read and loved this year. Some of them also tell me which books or authors they hope to read in 2019. Now, I'd like to get this episode out to you with a couple of weeks before the holidays so it can inspire some book buying ideas, some New Year's reading resolutions, and otherwise give you something to look forward to while the days are getting shorter, you know? And, as I mentioned, this is actually a double episode this time because after we finish with the guest list, we'll have a conversation with Bill Kartalopoulos, the editor of the Best American Comics series. The 2018 edition of Best American Comics came out recently, so we thought that would be a good year-end topic, too. Now, we got responses from more than 30 of 2018's pod guests, plus a couple of past guests who I was corresponding with and said, hey, may as well tell me favorite book from 2018 and maybe what you want to get to in 2019. I did not think that through correctly because the two guys I asked that of are voracious readers, so they provided massive lists of their faves. Anyway, I don't give too much of an intro to any of the guests during this episode, so I hope you'll look up this episode and its great roster in our archives. If you visit either chimeraobscura.com/vm or vmspod.com, you'll find a link to the Guest List 2018. And that page has links to all the books mentioned this time around, as well as links to each guest's episode if you want to hear more from them. And if you're interested in my favorite reads from the past year and my 2019 goals, I'll tell you those at the end, okay? Now let's get started. Henry Wessels, from his site, endlessbookshelf.net, writes, Lion City, Stories by Ng-Yi Sheng. It's a remarkable collection of short, fantastical tales of a world city from a young Singapore author, remarkable for the transgressive and transformative use of folklore and history, and for making new stories from old tropes and conceits. Within the span of a few pages, the title story plays with Phildickian anxieties about simulation, the place of wildlife in the built environment, and makes the shape-changing story display some new dance steps. A Day at Terminal Aleph is a superior airport story, and its chronicle of VIP travelers is anchored in observing people at work. Singapore gastronomy and local history are at the heart of such tales as Food Paradise and The Crocodile Prince. Sin is a dark, funny collision of demons and industrial pollution. For me, the other gem is The Boy, the Swordfish, the Bleeding Island, which demonstrates the range of Ng-Yi Sheng's wit and imagination and innovation. 500 years of history, folklore, and literature are rewritten in a bold, anti-colonial counterfactual so persuasive I was ready to seek library holdings of the novels of Iris Fonseca, in which, among my many delights, quote, Dr. Mary Godwin, a noted prodigy in the field of experimental surgery, is brought by hovercraft to the court of Sultan Nadim, Emperor of China and the Malay Archipelago. The tale concludes with another useful shift of perspective. The author is adventurous with form. The core of The Boy, etc. appears as an engaging scholarly article, while Garden is a concise adventure along multiple forking paths and recurring outcomes. The best book I read in 2018. Separately, Henry added, the new books from Andy Duncan and Maria Headley and Levi Tadar's Unholy Land are all superior books. He also writes, I have a book to write in the first half of 2019, so I will say I will seek diversion in the works of Sir Thomas Browne in a good lifetime edition until the thing is written. Oh, and I hear Tim Moen's forthcoming book is good, but I have not seen it yet. And that book comes up a couple of times this episode. Henry's recent book is A Conversation Larger Than the Universe. Alberto Manguel writes, for 2018, Edgardo Kozarinsky's The Bride of Odessa. He says, I reread it before he won this year's Garcia Marquez Prize for the best collection of short stories in Spanish for En el último trago nos vamos, not yet translated into English. For 2019, he writes, I want to read volumes 2 and 3 of Rainer Stock's biography of Kafka. If they're anything like the first volume, The Early Years, which I read last December, I'll say that this is one of the most extraordinary biographical achievements of the last decades. Alberto's most recent book is Packing My Library, an elegy and 10 digressions. Stephen Heller writes, 2018, 1984. I reread this Orwell classic because I also read the more recent Churchill and Orwell by Thomas Ricks. I wanted to prove to myself that things in the world could not get much worse. I guess I proved that we come in a close second, kind of, with what could be in the offing. For 2019, Iron Heel by Jack London, in 1908, 110 years ago, the so-called first dystopic American novel, looking back from 6 decades in the future vantage point, where the oligarchies rule the world and their armies and quote-unquote mercenaries execute the activist proletariat and radical socialist revolutionaries. It was an incredible portent of certain aspects of the future with all the same lingo we use today. Stephen blogs about design at The Daily Heller. J.J. Settlemeyer writes, This is a tough ask for me because 2018 has been a crazy year. I don't think I finished one book this year other than Pen, Paper, and Printing Ink by Andrew King, his 1970 combo autobiography and chronology of Canadian/Canadienne printing history. It's directly related to a story I'm working on about his King Show print company that produced posters from the 1910s to the 1950s. Frankly, I don't think I picked up any books this year that weren't directly related to research projects I'm working on. In addition to the animation I do, I have projects focusing on graphic arts, cartooning, animation, and transit/railway history. Oh, and to put a sparkling jewel on top of everything else, 2018 saw the wedding of our daughter Chloe. Congrats! JJ's animation studio is jjsettlemaier.com, and Settlemaier is Sedelmaier. Look up the episode, you'll find him there. Now here's Jerry Beck. He provided some audio for his faves.
Hello, this is Jerry Beck, and Gil Roth asked me to what my favorite book read in 2018 was, and also if there was a book or author I hope to get into in 2019. I think the answer I have is covers both questions. I just received the mammoth 800-page, 10-pound Taschen book, Mickey Mouse, The Ultimate Edition. I think that's the name of it. I'm going to look it up. It might be The Ultimate History. So I'm going to look for that right now. There it is. The Ultimate History. Mickey Mouse, The Ultimate History by J.B. Kaufman and David Gerstein, both friends of mine. This is the ultimate book about Mickey Mouse. And you might be thinking, why do I need a 10-pound gigantic Taschen book about the history of Mickey Mouse? But wait till you see it. Take a look at it. That answers the question right there. It's insane, but it's literally the last word. And I know the two authors, and they've spent a long time, their whole lives, amassing the amount of information in here about that character. Not to mention they had the complete access to the Walt Disney archives, and there's a ton of stuff that people like me and them haven't seen ever. Proposed cartoons that were never made by famed cartoonists that are not known to have worked at the Disney studio. I mean, they just unearthed literally page after page. There's something in the text or the illustrations that you, even if think you know everything, you have not seen the material. So I know I'm sounding like a gigantic plug. I make no money off of this. It just arrived. I'm recording this at the end of the year in December of 2018. I'm going through it now. I'm perusing it, and it is the read of the year, and it's going to take me well into 2019 to get through it. So that's my plug, and I hope Merry Christmas to you all.
Jerry recently curated the Museum of Modern Art screening Cartoons You Won't See on TV, and he's written a ton of books on the history of animation. David Small writes, "The book I have just put down, Tim Gatreau's Welding with Children, Short Stories, has eclipsed my memory of everything I've read this past year and sent me scurrying to find all of his other books. This is a collection of short stories from 1999 from what I assume to be a mythical Louisiana town called Grand Crapeau, full of violence, emotional and physical, dark humor, and morality worthy of Flannery O'Connor. And that is a comparison I do not, I promise you, make lightly." As for 2019 reading, David writes, "I'm looking forward to rereading some of Thomas Mann's short novels, and to whatever else I may discover in my peripatetic wanderings through great literature of the past." David's recent graphic novel is Home After Dark. Nora Krug writes, "I'm happy to answer, but can only do a short one because I am swamped. 2018, No Mercy, A Journey into the Heart of the Congo by Redmond O'Hanlon. 2019, Philip Roth." And nothing wrong with that, Nora. Nora's recent book is one of my faves from this year, Belonging, A German Reckons with History and Home. Nathaniel Popkin writes, 2018 favorites, you ask an impossible question. So I have a few, and the selections reflect my interest in both minimalism and maximalism, if that's a thing, in literature. The first is Welsh author Sinan Jones's Cove. I'm a bit addicted to his slenderest of slender prose style, emotion revealed with the fewest words. In this sense, and in his character's confrontation with the natural world, his work can be likened to another minimalist, Swiss writer Arnaud Kamenisch. As I talked about in our podcast this year, I found Clarice Lispector's The Chandelier to be the most exceptional picture of the inner life of young people. Scholastique Mukasonga, the French-Rwandan writer, put out 2 books this year in English. Barefoot Woman, a memoir of her mother during exile, is stunning in its directness and beauty. Finally, the maximalist, at least for the use of a single, endless, wearying paragraph. David al-Bahari's Gotz and Meyer, a much earlier, haunting novel on the Holocaust. 2019 aspiration? I plan to dig into the work of Eduardo Halfon, the Guatemalan Spanish-American novelist. Nathaniel's recent book is Everything is Borrowed. Kathy B. Graham writes a quick one. 2018, reread Vanity Fair. 2019, trying to get through Remembrance of Things Past by Marcel Proust, but I try every year and fail. You should check out Second Bloom, Kathy Graham's Art of the Table from Vendome Press. Now here's Ken Crimstein with some audio about his faves.
Hi, Gil. So I think the best book that I read, well, there are two. It's a tie, maybe. The best book I read is Kim by Rudyard Kipling, which was on the list of the top 100 books by another guest of yours. I think it was from a podcast, Alberto Manguel. And Kim just surprised me because even though I know that Kipling may be quote-unquote problematic for some people, I just was taken by his large mind and covering of so much territory in and multi-diverse cultures and mysticism in the subcontinent at that time, and incredible writing. And then I followed up with some writing about it from Randall Jarrell, who had so much to say about Kipling, and what a fascinating character. But Kim, I thought, was just a masterful work. And then in the graphic novel or graphic category, I would have to put in Peplum, Peplum, by the French graphic novelist Blutch, Blutch. Just an incredible tour de force of drawing and limited words. So two incredible pieces there, very different. Peplum dealing with ancient Rome, again in a very mystical, heightened sense, sort of the same feeling that I got from Kim. And looking forward to, without question, R. Crumb's Dream Diary, over 400 pages of Crumb. I mean, forget about it. I can't wait to get it. So thanks a lot, and have a great 2019. Ken Crimstein here. Thank you.
Ken's recent book is The Three Escapes of Hannah Arendt. Lance Richardson writes, "The best book I read that was published this year was How to Write an Autobiographical Novel by Alexander Chee. I've admired his work for a long time, and I think he just knocked it out of the park with this collection, which manages to be, simultaneously, a deeply moving memoir and a fully functional writing lesson. His essay on working for William and Pat Buckley is one of the best essays I've ever read in any year. The best book I read that was not published this year is The Dawn Watch, Joseph Conrad in a Global World by Maya Jasanoff. A mix of biography, travel writing, and literary criticism, I could not put it down, which is rather extraordinary as I've only read one book by Joseph Conrad and was unmoved by it. If only all biographies were so vivid and exciting." For 2019, Lance writes, "Because I'm writing a book about Peter Matheson, I have many books by him to get through, not to mention books on Zen, LSD, the CIA, and Connecticut wasps. But aside from work stuff, I really want to read a good translation of the Aeneid, and 7 Pillars of Wisdom by T.E. Lawrence. I'm also a quarter of the way into Jill Lepore's These Truths, and think it's absolutely brilliant. So I hope to finish that by April. Irony of the writer's life, so little time for reading." Lance's recent book is another of my faves that'll be on the end of this episode, House of Nutter, The Rebel Tailor of Savile Row. Chris Reynolds writes, "My favorite book read this year is probably Born Liars by Ian Leslie. Next year, I want to read some more Cordwainer Smith, as I just have the Ballantine Best of Cordwainer Smith so far." New York Review Books Comics collected Chris's absolutely haunting and amazing comics in The New World, Comics from Mauritania. Paul Karasik writes, 2018, "In my backpack, I carried around an old paperback of Julius Lester's To Be a Slave, dipping into it while waiting for a plane, train, or bus until it fell apart completely. It is a sobering, chilling, and profound collection of brief recollections by people who were slaves in the U.S. prior to emancipation. I need a new copy, and so do you. 2 larger-than-life men whom I admire died this year, so I relished rereading Tamara Shopson's memoir, Arbitrary Stupid Goal, about growing up with her dad, Kenny. I also dug out my copy and finally actually read Learned Pigs and Fireproof Women by Ricky Jay. And The Train by George Simenon is a tiny gem by a man who made tiny gems by the bucketful." For 2019, The Goat-Getters by Eddie Campbell. And, though I have now owned this book for several years and have read much of it, I plan to actually sit down and read from start to finish The Origins of Comics, from William Hogarth to Winsor McCay, by Thierry Smolderin, who thinks and writes in a singular way about comics in a cultural context. Paul collaborated with Mark Newgarden on the amazing book How to Read Nancy, The Elements of Comics in 3 Easy Panels. Speaking of Mark Newgarden, 3 recent favorites, Mark writes, Joseph Mitchell's Up in the Old Hotel, which was a reread, Mark Derry's Edward Gorey bio, Born to be Posthumous, and I'm currently reading a few pages per night of R. Crumb's Dream Diary. I just finished a bio of L. Frank Baum, which wasn't very good, by the way. For 2019, Mark writes, I have a copy of Daniel P. Mannix's Step Right Up, hidden in a room at my brother's beach house in New Jersey. I've read it there every summer for the past decade, and I imagine I'll read it there again this summer. Seriously, check out Mark and Paul's How to Read Nancy. It's an amazing book. Robert Andrew Parker, Bob's wife, Judy, writes, Bob read The Soldier's Art by the English writer Anthony Pohl from the series of novels called A Dance to the Music of Time. He's one of Bob's favorite writers. Bob's not on email, so Judy wrote for him. I also started rereading Pohl's series a few weeks ago, and that's one of my 2019 goals, as you'll find out at the end of the show. Dave McKean writes, my great discovery of 2018, only 40 years late, is Patrick Leigh Fermor and his travel memoir, starting in Holland and finishing in Constantinople, told in 3 volumes, A Time of Gifts, Between the Woods and the Water, and The Broken Road. Written from the 70s to his death a few years ago, but remembering back to 1933-34 and the turbulent changes raging through Europe, it's also a prescient read for our times. A staggering piece of sensual memory and erudition on practically every subject. For 2019, I'm hoping for an English translation of L'Âge d'Or by Cyril Pedrosa. Dave's done a ton of work in recent years, art, writing, direction, every damn thing else, but his graphic novel, Black Dog, The Dreams of Paul Nash, that just continues to haunt me more than a year after I read it. Michael Gerber writes, forgive me if my sentences don't snap, but I'm writing this at 1:03 a.m., moments after shipping American Bystander number 9. Assuming that our printer doesn't spit back some Dadaesque nightmare, tomorrow will be spent winnowing 3 hours of material into our first podcast. Then, if any vitality remains, I must try to write a charming letter to the IRS. Wish me luck. In 2018, I really enjoyed reading Adrian Goldsworthy's biography of Julius Caesar, Sean Levy's Dolce Vita Confidential, and Gore Vidal's Julian. You may notice a pattern. I'm endlessly collecting material for my YA novel set in ancient Rome. Oh, I also enjoyed Sticky Fingers, a rather lurid biography of Jan Wenner, who would have fit right in among Caesar and the rest. Is that John Wenner or Jan? Anyway, what book do I hope to get to in 2019? Well, has anyone written How to Charm the IRS? I'd read the hell out of that for sure. Michael Gerber is the editor and publisher of The American Bystander, the finest humor magazine around. John Leland writes, this year I found sustenance in books that were very, very large in scope, particularly Factfulness, 10 Reasons We're Wrong About the World and Why Things Are Better Than You Think by Hans Rosling, These Truths by Jill Lepore, Sapiens by Yuval Noah Harari, and On Tyranny by Timothy Snyder. The world seemed to call for perspective and broad vision more than minute observation. Snyder's was the book I couldn't put down, but luckily I didn't have to. It's concise enough to read at a sitting, without histrionics, soberly pointing out one way our political world might head. Rosling was the perfect counterweight, reminding us that 1 billion people have moved out of the lowest level of poverty, and that the carnage we see on the nightly news is actually quite minor historically. Small comfort to the people affected, of course, and Lepore and Harari show how this is a membrane that separates us from them. Next year, I'm going to start with Hernan Diaz's In the Distance, a modern take on life in the American West. And I look forward to heading back out on the book circuit, where people told me the most amazing stories about the elders and their lives, reminding me that, contrary to my big picture reading, life actually happens on a small, intimate scale. Happy holidays to all. John's recent book is Happiness is a Choice You Make, Lessons from a Year Among the Oldest Old. Mark Derry didn't have time for 2019 goals, but his 2018 pick is Heidegger on Being Uncanny by Catherine Withy. It's simply mesmerizing, he writes. I've recently become fascinated by Heidegger, specifically the uncanniness of his ideas. Steeped in surrealism, as a way of looking at the world and moving through it, an applied philosophy and not just an art movement, and a close reader of Freud's On the Uncanny, I knew from the first that Heidegger was doing quote-unquote alien phenomenology, by which I mean he was far weirder than most philosophers seem to realize. His way of looking at the world instantly defamiliarizes it in a way that chimes both with the surrealist sense of the disquietude pervading the everyday and Freud's uncanny, not to mention object-oriented ontologies, depersonalizing flat ontology, in which the human-centered worldview gives way to a post-human perspective in which no single entity can lay claim to being the measure of all things phenomenologically. I searched high and low for philosophical writings that preceded from this premise, but found nothing but the usual yawningly unoriginal academic re-readings of aspects of his thought, until I stumbled onto Withy's book, An Unanswered Prayer. It's remarkably clear for a book on Heidegger, who, as the old joke goes, is famously untranslatable, even into German, and brimming with insights. I got it via interlibrary loan and read as much as I could until time ran out, then coughed up the books for a used copy, gotten online, where it's harder to find than unicorn horns. Withy's quietly disquieting book is not only a profoundly important contribution to Heidegger scholarship, but, to the delight of surrealists everywhere, the lost chapter from a secret history of the uncanniness of the world. Mark's recent book is Born to be Posthumous, The Eccentric Life and Mysterious Genius of Edward Gorey. Richard Kadri writes, for 2018, I'm Thinking of Ending Things by Ian Reid. This novel starts off as the somewhat mild-mannered story of a romance that might be going nowhere. Then it takes an abrupt left turn and morphs into a Lynchian fever dream. The book's also relatively short, so you have no excuse not to read it. And Survivor's Club. This graphic novel has a mad but perfect premise, one that, in other hands, could fall apart completely. 6 kids who were haunted by terrifying occult occurrences in 1987 are thrown back together 30 years later when it seems the same thing is happening again, and maybe what happened to them wasn't so random after all. Beautifully written by Lauren Bukes and Dale Halverson, with art by Ryan Kelly. For 2019, I'm looking forward to Chuck Wendig's Wanderers. Chuck is a great storyteller, and Wanderers is both his biggest and most ambitious work. I'm also waiting for The Lady from the Black Lagoon by Mallory O'Meara. It's a biography of Millicent Patrick, a designer and special effects innovator in the 50s who's been largely forgotten or ignored by the movie industry. Richard's most recent Sandman Slim novel is Hollywood Dead. Dean Haspiel offers up some audio.
Hey, Gil, this is Dean Haspiel, creator of the graphic novel The Red Hook, Volume 1, New Brooklyn, published by Image Comics, and artist of the Alcoholic 10th Anniversary Expanded Edition, written by Jonathan Ames and published by Berger Books. Here are quick reviews of my 2 favorite books of 2018, a graphic novel by 2 veterans of the comic book form, and a debut novel written by a seasoned actor. Kill or Be Killed, published by Image Comics, written by Ed Brubaker, illustrated by Sean Phillips, and colored by Elizabeth Breitweiser. I've been a fan of Brubaker's writing ever since he was a pup in the comic book industry, writing and drawing indie comics. He once got mad at me and threatened, "You're 1 pubic hair away from getting punched in the face." Later on, he crashed my apartment in Brooklyn when he flew in from L.A. to pitch and score a career-changing gig writing Batman, Catwoman, and Gotham Central, which led to his groundbreaking Captain America run, which introduced the Winter Soldier. After a successful time writing for DC and Marvel Comics, Ed returned to his roots and has produced a plethora of creator-owned comics with his art partner, Sean Phillips, also published by Image Comics. Kill or Be Killed is a great first-person story where the narrative is intense yet unreliable as a tortured man exacts brutal justice upon criminals at the behest of a demon. The subtitle could have been Sick of It All. A great read that keeps you on the edge of your seat. Fans of Martin Scorsese's Taxi Driver and Jonathan Ames' You Were Never Really Here will enjoy Kill or Be Killed. The Perfume Burned His Eyes, published by Akashic Books, written by Michael Imperioli. Whenever you hear that an actor is writing a novel, you roll your eyes. How dare we accept the concept that an actor can do anything more than pretend on screen and or on stage? You wonder if he or she had a ghostwriter, or maybe they're transitioning to books because they're aging out of their perceived demographic. At best, you think he or she should just write their tell-all book from their life and time in Hollywood. Not this time. Not this guy. Michael Imperioli is the real deal. Having written episodes of HBO's The Sopranos and other stuff, including a feature-length movie, Michael's novel debut is a coming-of-age story in the big, bad New York City of the 1970s, where a 16-year-old boy must confront and negotiate sex, drugs, and an upstairs neighbor come spiritual mentor in the guise of rock music legend Lou Reed. Michael's writing is blue-collar, yet irreverent and all too human. The Perfume Burned His Eyes is a great, brisk read with a mountain of heart. Thanks for letting me weigh in on my two favorite books I read in 2018. Happy holidays.
Dean also writes, in 2019, I'm looking forward to reading Bret Easton Ellis's White for all the obvious and not so obvious reasons. Dean's most recent comic is The Red Hook, and he recently produced his play The Last Bar at the End of the World. I decided to invite past guest Jim Ottaviani to participate when we were corresponding last week. He wasn't on this past year, but he's a pal and a good reader, so here we go. Words, Homegoing by Ya Gyasi. H is for Hawk by Helen MacDonald, audio read by the author. Jesus' Son by Dennis Johnson, audio read by the author. Endure by Alex Hutchinson. Game Time by Roger Angle. I Will Be Complete, a memoir by Glenn David Gold, and Lincoln in the Bardo by George Saunders, audio read by the author and many others. Comics, he writes, Hawkeye by Kelly Thompson and Leonardo Romero. Genius Illustrated, The Life and Art of Alex Toth by Dean Mullaney and Bruce Canwell. The Complete Peanuts, 1985 to 2000 by Charles Schultz. You and a Bike and a Road by Eleanor Davis, and Berlin, City of Lights, Volume 3 by Jason Lutz. And somewhere in between, How to Read Nancy by Paul Karasik and Mark Newgarden. As for 2019, Jim writes, as usual, I don't really have a plan, but I'll probably get to Neil Gaiman's Norse Mythology, audio, read by him, and Ryan North's How to Invent Everything. I look forward to both. Oh, and some more Cormac McCarthy. Jim's most recent book is The Imitation Game, Alan Turing Decoded, but he's working on new stuff. Willard Spiegelman had no time for full write-ups, but he says 2018, John Williams' Stoner, and 2019, well, I'm currently rereading Bleak House, but that'll probably take most of the next year. Willard's most recent book is If You See Something, Say Something. A Writer Looks at Art. Mark Ulrichsen writes, sorry, Gil, my life is pretty full, so no write-ups. In no particular order, my 2018 faves are The Circle by Dave Eggers, The Devil in the White City by Eric Larson, and Liner Notes by Loudon Wainwright III. For 2019, my Bard bookshelf, that's Braille and reading disabled, has A Confederacy of Dunces by John Kennedy Toole, The Genius of Dogs, How Dogs Are Smarter Than You Think by Brian Hare and Vanessa Woods, A Gentleman in Moscow by Amor Towles, and The Soul of America, The Battle for Our Better Angels by John Meacham. Mark's art graced the cover of The New Yorker for its Halloween issue and has been on a bunch of other covers, and he's done illustrations everywhere. And anyway, Mark's a wonderful, wonderful artist. Shahar Pinsker writes, my 2018 faves were The Ruined House by Ruby Namda and How the Other Half Looks by Sarah Blair. No plans for 2019. Shahar's recent book is A Rich Brew, How Cafes Created Modern Jewish Culture. Here's Christopher Brown, who also sent some audio.
Hi, Gil. It's Chris Brown in Austin. Thanks for having me back for your year-end reading roundup. A lot of my reading this year has been research for the novel I've been working on. It's called Rule of Capture. It's a speculative legal thriller coming out from Harper next year, and that's had me reading all sorts of dark legal tomes as source books for a kind of dystopian extrapolation. You'd be amazed how many how-to books you can find on the administration of martial law on U.S. soil down in the bowels of the law library, especially if you go back far enough. I'm hoping I'm the only one using them as manuals. But out of that research reading, there's one book I'd recommend to any reader, especially anyone interested in law and justice. And that's The Guantanamo Lawyers, edited by Mark Denbo and Jonathan Haffetz. It's an oral history of the lawyers who provided pro bono defenses to the detainees in front of the military tribunals at Gitmo. It's oral history, so it's told through anecdote and quotidian detail. In this case, through the voices of a diverse group of lawyers with otherwise ordinary trial practices back home who find themselves in this kind of Kafkaesque horror show where the normal rules of justice and due process don't really apply. Not a new book, but one that I think deserves wider attention and that tells an important American story in a very unique and compelling way. One that this kind of narrative form is uniquely well suited to telling, and that accretes into something pretty powerful. Maybe less quotidian, more in the big ideas department, are two new works of deep history I've been reading. One is Against the Grain by James Scott, which is a fascinating examination of whether our current predicament as a planet is ultimately rooted in the agricultural revolution, not something we can easily undo. And The Great Leveler by Walter Scheidel, which is a sobering study of how the profound wealth inequality we see today and have seen at various points through human history has rarely been remedied other than through the mass destruction of wealth and life through war, revolution, plague, or societal collapse, the kind of four horsemen of the book. And even then, never for long. And not exactly sunny holiday reading, but important guides, I think, to the kind of radically deep problems we have to solve if we want to build a better future. And on the topic of futures, I've been reading a ton of new science fiction this year as a judge for the Philip K. Dick Award. I can't talk about any of those books yet, but I can talk about one 2019 book I just got to read that I'm pretty excited about. That's Infinite Detail, the debut novel of Tim Maughan, a New York-based English journalist. It's the story of a kind of a breakaway community in near-future Bristol that manages to engineer its own digital and political economy and maybe map out a sort of a path for everybody. It's told with a wonderful clarity of voice, full of fresh ideas. But what I really love about it is it's the rare science fiction that manages to envision the end of capitalism rather than the end of the world. And the kind of book I'd like to see more of. Highly recommended. Thanks, and talk to you next year.
Chris's recent and debut novel is the amazing Tropic of Kansas. Levi Tadar writes, looking at my very short list of 2018 readings, Noon, 22nd Century by Arkady and Boris Strugatsky. It's a linked story collection of Soviet utopian future history, and it's brilliant. Levi's most recent book is Unholy Land. Irvin Ungar writes, I thoroughly enjoyed reading Daniel Gordis's prize-winning book on Israel and David Watts's trilogy of Western books. The last one is Possum Trot. Irv's most recent book is Arthur Schick, Soldier in Art. Hal Mayforth just sent the list: Arthur and George by Julian Barnes, Lincoln in the Bardo by George Saunders, The Man in the High Castle by Philip K. Dick, The March by E.L. Doctorow, The Name of the Rose by Umberto Eco. And he writes, up next, The Pillars of the Earth by Ken Follett. Next year, I hope to read more Dickens and Twain. No new book from Hal, but check out his music on SoundCloud. It's soundcloud.com/Mayforth, and that's MAY4TH. Audrey Niffenegger writes, the books that interested me most in my reading this year: The Life of Stuff by Susanna Walker, To Be a Machine by Mark O'Connell, Gwen by Goldie Goldblum, Antifa, the Anti-Fascist Handbook by Mark Bray. Next books I'm planning to read: Palatino, The Natural History of a Typeface by Robert Bringhurst, The Museum of Lost Art by Noah Charney, and Fashion Victims, The Dangers of Dress, Past and Present by Allison Matthews David. Audrey collaborated with Eddie Campbell on the recent comic collection Bizarre Romance, and she's also working on her sequel to The Time Traveler's Wife. Roz Chast writes, this fall has been bats between work and marriage of a kid and having shingles and shows and everything else, so sorry for the delay in responding. Here's a quick list of books I read and loved this year. 3 novels: Convenience Store Woman by Sayaka Murata, Skylark by Dejo Kostolyani, you'll look it up, and God's End by John Ray. Right now, I'm reading Blood and Guts, A History of Surgery by Roger Hollingham. Nonfiction and amazing. Absolutely mesmerizing. Roz's cartoons appear regularly in The New Yorker, and her recent book is Going Into Town, A Love Letter to New York. Dave Calver, whom I met through Roz, writes, my favorites in 2018 were Dress Your Family in Corduroy by David Sedaris, Sharp Objects by Gillian Flynn, and Crackpot by John Waters. For 2019, I want to check out Roz's suggestions. And you should check out Limbo Lounge from Dave. It's a really good book. I also added past guest Levi Stahl when he posted this big list of his favorite reads in 2018 on his Twitter feed. Problem was, I didn't realize quite how long it was going to be. It's just a list, no descriptions. Follow Levi on Twitter at Levi Stahl, S-T-A-H-L. You won't be sorry. But here goes. The Library Book by Susan Orlean, Something Wholesale by Eric Newby, The Cherry Tree by Adrian Bell, River by Esther Kinsky, Home Sweet Homicide by Craig Rice, The Real Lolita by Sarah Weinman, Only to Sleep by Lawrence Osborne, Sunburn from Laura Lipman, I'll Be Gone in the Dark from Michelle McNamara, The Infinite Blacktop by Sarah Gran, Under an English Heaven by Donald Westlake, The Man on a Donkey, H.F.M. Prescott, The Corner That Held Them, Sylvia Townsend Warner, The Broken Earth Trilogy by N.K. Jemisin, Ancestors in the Attic, Michael Holroyd, The Golden State by Lydia Kieslig, Motherhood by Sheila Heti, Weed Eater, an illustrated novel by Robert Gippy, or Gipe, Lost Empress by Sergio de la Pava, Compulsory Game by Robert Aikman, The Best of the Best Horror of the Year, edited by Ellen Datlow, Anniversaries by Uwe Johnson, and How to Write an Autobiographical Novel by Alexander Chee. Like I say, just follow Levi on Twitter and you won't be sorry. A few years ago, he was the editor of the Donald Wake nonfiction miscellany, The Getaway Car, which I love. And that's it for our guests. Before we get to our conversation, I have to tell you my guest list books, because I know you guys are just waiting on pins and needles for that one. I segment my reading between stuff for the podcast and discretionary/fun reads. I'm just going to mention the books here because in early January, I'll post my annual Another Year in the Books write-up on the Virtual Memories blog, where I go over every book I read. And you can find that at chimeraobscura.com/VM/blog. First, for 2019, my only real goal is rereading Anthony Pohl's A Dance to the Music of Time. As far as pod goals go, reading Robert Caro's LBJ bio, because I'm hoping to get Robert Caro next year, but we'll see how that goes. Favorite fiction by this year's guests. I didn't read a ton of prose novels for the show, but the standout has to be Tropic of Kansas by Christopher Brown. I love that book. I foisted it off on people. You should do the same. For nonfiction, the books that really stick with me have been House of Nutter, The Rebel Tailor of Savile Row by Lance Richardson, I Will Be Complete, a memoir by Glenn David Gold, Born to be Posthumous, The Eccentric Life and Mysterious Genius of Edward Gorey by Mark Derry, and A Conversation Larger Than the Universe by the first guest I cited this episode, Henry Wessels. It's Henry's history of science fiction as reflected through his collection of some of the great works of its past. But again, I'll go into all this stuff in the year-end write-up. My favorite comic by a guest would have to be Nora Krug's graphic memoir, Belonging. A German reckons with history and home. That one is one of the most affecting books I've read in a long time. The weird runner-up is Chris Reynolds' The New World, Comics from Mauritania. That's just so strange and weirdly compelling that I can't forget the experience of reading those stories for the first time. I also really dug Michael Kupperman's graphic memoir, All the Answers. Now, for non-podcast reading, I started the year with Didion's Slouching Toward Bethlehem and Sebald's The Rings of Saturn, both of which were just mind-blowing. I had a couple of weeks before I had to launch into pod reading, and that's my idea of fun. Now, I was also floored later in the year by Joseph Conrad's Victory, which I got turned on to by Clive James from some of his essays in recent years. I also read Alan Hollinghurst's 2004 novel, The Line of Beauty, which just knocked me the hell out. And that was a recommendation from Lance Richardson, the House of Nutter guy. There's an outside shot I'll end up recording with Hollinghurst someday, so this could sort of be podcast reading, but that's a really amazing novel. But like I say, there'll be a long-winded write-up about all of that in a few weeks. For now, that is it for the 2018 edition of the Guest List on the Virtual Memories Show. And that means it's time for my conversation with Bill Kartalopoulos, editor of the Best American Comics series. Rather than ramble through a big intro, let's dive right into it. Here's a short version of Bill's bio. There's more on his website, onpanel.com. Bill Kartalopoulos is a comics critic, educator, curator, and editor. He is a series editor for the #1 New York Times best-selling Best American Comics series, published annually by Houghton Mifflin Harcourt. He teaches classes at Parsons and at SVA. He lives in Brooklyn, where he's writing a book about comics. And now, the Virtual Memories conversation with Bill Kartalopoulos. But did you have anywhere good to buy comics when you were growing up?
When I was growing up, I started out buying comics just at the grocery store. Mm-hmm. There was a kind of regional chain called Lanco that I think was Pennsylvania based. Mm-hmm. And they were sort of like a combination grocery store, department store. And that's where my parents used to do their grocery shopping. So I would always volunteer to go along for the grocery shopping because I would just hang out in the magazine section and look at all of the Marvel and DC comics, which I think were about 75 cents at the time, and figure out which ones I was going to get with my allowance. So,
mm-hmm. Did you have like luncheonettes and sweet shops and things like that? Those were the other like little side places.
There were
in
a couple
Jersey.
of random places. There was, weirdly, I remember there was this like camera and photography shop in our area. It wasn't like right along our most common
thoroughfare
plan path of activity, but they weirdly, for no reason other than I assume the person who worked there liked comic books, had a comic book rack. And I think they were also like newsstand, just getting it through a news agent, but because these things are a bit randomized, sometimes they would have different comic books than the grocery store did. So once in a while I was able to prevail upon my parents to take me over to the camera shop to see if like they had that issue of Spider-Man or something that I couldn't find at the grocery store. When I got a little older in the 90s, we did have a dedicated comic book shop, really of the worst kind, even though I was very grateful for it then, and I'm sure it sustained my interest in that. It was basically run by someone who had previously been a sports card dealer. Mm-hmm. And that was kind of the moment where the collectible sports card bubble had burst and the comic book speculation bubble was forming. This was like Death of Superman, Image Comics, #1 issues kind of period. A lot of chromium covers and polybagged things with trading cards inside. It was
an awful, awful time.
And people telling, guileless children that these were good investments and things like that. So it wasn't like, even though it was, they had a lot of stuff that one wouldn't have found at the grocery store. It wasn't like the rich opportunity to discover like the Hernandez brothers or something like that.
Yeah, do you remember that moment for you when you moved from superheroes into what we'll just call art comic? I don't even know. Good comics. The comics that we love now.
Yeah, I mean, it was probably pretty late for me relative to some people who are my peers, because I have spoken to people or just heard tell of people who, in like high school found whatever, whether it be Love and Rockets or Crumb or John Porcellino zines or something, any, whatever that the point of entry might have been for someone. And kind of immediately had that bolts of lightning moment of like, oh, this is way better than the stuff that I'm reading. Whereas because a big part of it was I didn't have access to that stuff until well into college. But I was always kind of a slow person to make a change from one type of reading material to another. And I think throughout college, it was kind of this transitional period for me of discovering other kinds of things and sort of slowly, gradually phasing those in, and then simultaneously sort of phasing out the more commercial kind of genre comics that I'd still been reading, but more as a kind of habitual light entertainment than with the kind of high level of devotion. Obsessive interest that I would have had when I was like 10 years old, combing through the magazine racks at the grocery store. I went to school in New Hampshire, and again, there was a comic book store within driving distance, but it was very much predominantly like a role-playing game type of store. And again, like maybe once a semester I could like prevail upon a friend with a car to take me over there, and I'd find some interesting things, but it was still very kind of genre sci-fi fantasy oriented. But gradually I found things, and also because I grew up in New Jersey, I would go into New York. I started going to Jim Hanley's Universe and Forbidden Planet and places like that, and eventually by the end of college, finding other friends who were interested in comic books, being introduced to things through them, ranging from 8-Ball to Tank Girl, just that wide range of quote unquote indie comics, some of which are a little more pop, some of which are a little more specifically weirdly subcultural, and by the end of college, certainly being a lot more into that stuff for sure.
Tell me how Best American Comics came about for you as series editor. It's been 3 or 4 years.
The first volume that I worked on was the 2014 volume. Okay. So the 2018 volume that just came out is the 5th one that I've worked on. But because of the weird time lag involved in Best American Comics, where it takes about a year to put the book together, the first volume that I worked on, the 2014 book, covered material that was published between late 2012 and late 2013. So I guess technically I've been working in the role since 2012, even though the first volume that I worked on came out in 2014.
But it feels like your whole life.
It's been a while. But anyway, Matt Madden and Jessica Abel had been the series editors for 6 years. They weren't the founding series editors. The first volume came out in 2006, and Anne Elizabeth Moore was the series editor for 2 years. Then Matt Madden and Jessica Abel collaboratively were series editors for 6 years, and then they got a year-long residency in France. So if I had a year-long residency in France, I would have
goodbye American
been
Comics.
Very happy to pack up the house and move over there and let go of some of my professional obligations in the United States. So anyway, the exact mechanics of it, I'm actually not 100% sure of myself, other than that it seems that they recommended me for the job because I had been doing other work in comics up to that point. And I went in and interviewed at Houghton Mifflin Harcourt, and they offered me the position. So I've been working on that since then. So this 2018 book that just came out is the 5th volume I've worked on in the series.
And how's the interaction? I know you talk about it, or you write about it in the introduction of this one, but the interaction between you and the guest editor. Every year there's a guest editor who is a pretty well-known cartoonist. What's your interaction with it in selecting the initial material and then the interacting with them over the final selection?
Well, these Best American titles are all structured in a pretty similar way. It should probably be noted, in case anyone isn't aware of it, that this is part of a much broader umbrella of titles. Mm-hmm. Best American Short Stories has been coming out in some form or another since 1915. And over the years, gradually, this has essentially expanded to become a line of annual titles with Best American Comics, Best American Essays, Best American Travel Writing. There's been a number of different titles. I think there are 9 currently. So Best American Comics started in 2006, and almost all of these titles are structured in a very similar way, which is that there's a series editor who works on the title for multiple volumes. The duration of that service might vary from editor to editor and title to title, but there's someone who works on it for multiple volumes, kind of oversees the process, and every year also invites in a guest editor. So the series editor receives all of the submissions that come in for the book. And the nice thing about these books is that they are based on an open submission policy. There's a public address. We publicize it. It's literally printed in the foreword to every single volume of the series. Literally anyone can send their stuff in, and as long as it's by a North American artist, which includes Canada and Mexico, as long as it has been previously published, which can mean self-publishing, it can mean publishing on the web, and as long as it was originally published during the time frame we're considering for each volume, it's just as eligible as anything else we might get. So that means that it could be a handmade zine, or it could be a well-regarded, critically acclaimed graphic novel from a large corporate publisher. We look at them all with the same level of consideration. So anyway, the role of the series editor is to receive all the submissions as well as to kind of be cognizant of the field and poke around and prompt publishers and self-publishing artists to submit their work, to go to comic book stores, in my case, to go to festivals occasionally, to just be aware of the field and make sure we're getting as good a pool of material as possible. And at that point, I read and look at all of the submissions, which number in the many hundreds, and narrow it down to a pool of about 120 or so pieces that I send to each year's guest editor, and then they have the final say in terms of what goes into the book. And they also, the guest editor each year has the freedom to bring in some material they've discovered on their own. If there's something that they saw that they liked that's eligible, that didn't come through the process, they can still include it. So anyway, as far as that structure, that's pretty consistent across most of the best American titles. But then every year there's basically a different person involved. So the type of interaction that I have with that guest editor is different, some depending on, how much contact they want, how much support they want, how many questions they have, a whole range of issues. And if someone's local, like Ben Ketch or Roz Chast, I can do more work with them in person. The first year that I worked on the book, though, I was working with Scott McCloud, who was in California, and I'm in New York. And, all of our communication was through
little
phone calls
that he drew?
Phone calls, emails,
I thought you said
and
little Scott drawings.
No, phone calls, emails, and, boxes going back and forth through the mail. So, yeah.
Given how neurotic most cartoonists are, do they try and, ask you for a little extra judgment after they've pared down the list pretty well, or do they kind of achieve that final criteria, that final list on their own?
For the most part,
and I say neurotic in the best possible way.
Yeah, sure. Well, the truth is, it's a difficult process to narrow down that list to a final form. I don't. Sometimes I give some feedback, but has less to do with trying to determine or shape their choices, but sometimes just helping them figure out how to narrow it down in a practical way, because there is ultimately a specific page count that you need to get to. And sometimes someone will do pretty well getting to the point where they have a list of about 30-ish works that they think that they want to include, but that might include graphic novels that need to be excerpted and things like that. Sometimes I help them a little bit just with technical process of figuring out how that list might translate to the approximate number of pages that we need, maybe pointing out like, okay, if you want to include all this stuff, we can't, because you're going to have to cut 30 pages somewhere, and maybe saying, maybe you could trim this excerpt or this or that. But it's more, I try to keep it on the practical level, because up to that point, I've had a lot of opportunities to express my opinion, I think.
In that initial process.
Yeah, in the initial process of sorting. That's already a real kind of indirect collaboration. And, you know, in the process, too, we've usually had a bunch of conversations. And, you know, I express opinions sometimes, but I'm always very, very clear that ultimately their opinion is the most important one at the end of the day. Because I want them to be really happy about the book and excited about it, and to really be, you know, like I said, excited to show the world the pieces that they felt most strongly about. So I try to create the conditions for them to do that as much as possible.
Are there are there things you once complained about this anthology that now that you're the series editor, you realize, wow, that's actually a lot tougher than when I wasn't the series editor? The things that you may have been critical of before you started this that you...
as a reader?
Yeah.
I'm not sure. That's a good question. I know that I had at least some of the previous volumes before I started in the job. The truth is, I think maybe at the time as a reader, I felt a little bit like, I think I felt somewhat the way a lot of people who follow comics closely might feel, which is that, you know, these volumes were interesting, but included a lot of work that I was already familiar with. But one of the things that I think has changed since the series started is that somehow, against all odds, the comics field just keeps getting bigger and bigger each year. Mm-hmm. And I think when the series started out, it was right after that transitional moment when a lot of work that had previously only existed within a fairly clearly identifiable subculture of independent comics had started to enter into mainstream literary publishing culture as the graphic novel. Yeah. The graphic novel as a category is really something that stabilized in the early 2000s. And I think in some ways the emergence of Best American Comics in 2006 is kind of a symptom of that, or a consequence of that. So I think at the beginning, when the series started, it was a lot perhaps easier to clearly identify the parameters of the comics field. There were, you know, the things that were coming out from Drawn and Quarterly and Fantagraphics and Top Shelf and Alternative Comics and, you know, a handful of other indie publishers. There was some self-published work. And then there were the, you know, half a dozen new graphic novel lines that had popped up in the last several years. But since then, things have diversified dramatically. Certainly the publishing within the mainstream publishing industry has continued. It's expanded into other areas like YA and middle grade graphic novels, which are a booming category. There are whole kind of subgenres that have popped up, like historical biography and this kind of thing in graphic novel form. Other kinds of nonfiction like graphic medicine and so forth. At the same time, the underground or independent field has continued to be quite robust with the emergence of all these independent comic book festivals like Cake and the others. And that culture has only blossomed and diversified. Other independent publishers have come into the field, Koyama Press, Uncivilized Books, etc. And of course, comics have kind of exploded online, which is a whole other category, or meta category of many categories. And comics have started popping up in places they didn't exist before, in, you know, online magazines or even in print magazines. Different kinds of journals will run comics occasionally, and so on. So I think maybe now more so than when it started, the book, if we're attentive enough, the book is better positioned to present an element of discovery even to an experienced and attentive comics reader.
Yeah, to that extent, how much are you surprised each year? How much do you get something like, wow, I had no idea this was out here until they submitted it, or I came across it at a festival?
A certain amount. I mean, every year I find things that surprise me. For the most part, a lot of the really small press stuff that sort of goes through the process is from people who I've at least been aware of for a certain period of time and whose work I've just been tracking. But every year there are people whose work I'd never seen before. And every year some of that stuff makes it into the book just about. For example, in this volume, there's that piece, the 2018 volume, there's a piece from a comic called Food Friends #2 by Michael Ridge with two teenagers sitting in a car talking to each other. And that was an artist who I'd never heard of before. The mini comic just showed up through our open submissions process. I thought it was really interesting, and I sent it along to the guest editor, Phoebe Gleckner, and she also liked it, and it ended up in the book. So I have no idea who this person is. I mean, I've had, little light professional contact with them now.
Yeah, but no real interaction.
But yeah, I've never, this is not someone whose work I was aware of outside of our submissions process. So, and I think every year there's, at least something like that. So.
And are there the occasional, holy crap, how did we miss X, Y, or Z? Or is that really dependent on people submitting, and you don't feel as bad if
there's no question that you're going to miss things. And all I can do is try my best. And I think part of what I guess I console myself with is if I miss something, it's like, well, okay, now I'm aware of that work now. Yeah. And I'll keep tracking that artist into the future. And if they keep making this great work, then I'm sure they'll be in some future volume of the series. One of the things that I think makes Best American Comics a little different from some of the other titles in the series, especially as compared to the founding title, Best American Short Stories, is that the scope is much broader. Short stories is, short self-contained literary fiction. It's not, Best American Fiction or Best American Prose or something like that. Whereas Best American Comics is a pretty broad brief because that includes short comics as well as graphic novels and web comics and serialized things that don't fit into easy categories and, potentially other kinds of things even from outside of the comics field as we might normally construct it. So I think with a brief that broad and a field where so much work is made in a kind of small press DIY sort of way, it's not possible to literally see everything. So I do my best, and of course we do have an open submissions policy. And if something isn't submitted, all I can do is make a really good faith effort to see as much as possible. But if I find out about something after the fact, then that just makes me want to track that artist's work moving forward.
Are there ever instances, it's something that came up in Harold Bloom's Western Canon book, and it's the section he hates the most, which is the compiling a list of what comprises the Western Canon. For the modern age, he cites Robert Lowell and Philip Larkin saying, I seem to be the only critic out there who thinks they're completely overesteemed, but I have to assume I'm blinded by extra aesthetic considerations, so I include them here. Which is a long way of saying, are there, without naming names, instances where, like, I don't get this isn't something I would include, but enough people seem to think this is great comics that I'm going to send this along to the guest editor and they can make up their mind? Given your background as a critic, particularly.
Yeah, I mean, I would say that falls maybe sometimes under a broader category of selection, which is that when I'm reading work, part of what I'm looking at is what do I think about this work and trying my best to be kind of objective, open-minded, engaged critic rather than just making like visceral gut choices. But I'm also thinking about what do I think the guest editor wants to see. Mm-hmm. And I think it's been pretty clear in my mind since I started that this is a collaboration, that I do want the guest editor to have a pool of material that they're going to be interested in and that is broad enough for them to discover what their own tastes might be in some ways. And so as a result, there's definitely work that I send along where it might not be my number one book of the year, but I think that for one reason or another, whatever that might be, the guest editor may be interested in seeing this.
And has it ever been the flip side of, Bill, why the hell did you send me X? Is that ever?
Sure. Well, I mean, I think every year I send something to one of the guest editors that they...
I never want to see this person's comics again.
That does the I think there was I don't remember if it was in her introduction or if it was in the panel that we did. Roz Chast had some line about it where she said something like, "They'll send me a lot of work, some of which tickled my fancy, the others of which did whatever the opposite of tickling my fancy is," or something like that. I'm really misquoting her and not being as funny as her. But yeah, I mean, so yeah, of course. But again, I just take that as a sign of having put together a successfully diverse pool of material, that they find things that they love and things that they hate.
Mm-hmm. What's this role taught you about comics? Besides just the sheer proliferation of stuff going on, what have you learned over 5-6 years of doing this?
Well, that's a hard question to answer abstractly, but I guess I think one of the things that it's really reinforced for me is that it's really, really important for anyone who wants to be any kind of critical reader in an ongoing way, whatever that means, whether that means you're serving some professional function as an editor, whatever, or just a critic, or just an engaged reader. It's really important to maintain an open mind, because you cannot predict what artists are going to do and what route comics are going to take moving forward. I think, and this is actually something I talk about a little bit in the introduction to this volume, I think one of the things that's really dangerous for anyone who's an engaged reader is that over time, one's tastes might become somehow conservative or narrow. That one might just seek out work that in some way resembles other work that one already likes. And even in the period of time that I've been working on this series, there are so many people whose work I'm paying attention to now who I wasn't aware of and weren't making work when I started in 2012. And this is something that I also know from teaching. Necessarily, people are going to keep coming into a field with very different reference points, different influences, different ideas about what they want to achieve with their work, a different concept of, how the work can or should exist in the world, different concepts of who the audience might be, and all this kind of stuff. So the work is necessarily going to evolve over time. So I think being in this position has been really, in some ways it's a huge amount of work, and it's perhaps not healthy to read hundreds of submissions every year, but I think it is very healthy to essentially be professionally obligated to keep a very open mind about a wide range of very different kinds of work over enough of a period of time that you can start to see some changes in the field, and to be in a position where it's I think your responsibility to pay attention and to take note about what might be interesting about the new or different kinds of things that might be coming along, that maybe in the past, that maybe if I had just been a reader, I would have just said, oh, that's not my kind of thing.
Yeah, which is largely, why I rely on you, Tom Spurgeon, and a few other people to clue me into what's happening. When I go to a festival, I'm going to look for, the people I already know, mm-hmm. which in my case is guys I discovered in the late 80s into the 90s, who are not making comics as often as they used to. So it's, necessary to figure out, who's in the next generation and next generation plus making good work, or who's showing up out of the blue like an Emil Ferris in her 50s, just dropping a bomb on everybody with this amazing piece of work. Webcomics versus print, both for inclusion in the collection and for your own, consumption style.
Yeah, it's hard to talk about online comics because I just feel like even online comics means a lot of different things to different people. I think there's a certain webcomics community. Maybe it's less definable than it used to be, but I think a certain kind of genre of webcomic or form of webcomic had some purchase for a while, which was this idea of the kind of either serialized webcomic that updated once or twice a week, or the gag comic like PvP or something like that updated a certain number of times a week, that always had this sort of consistent framing with the click this arrow to see the previous one, this arrow to see the next one, this one to see a random one, and below here's the blog where people can comment on, and up top here's a bunch of links and you can go to the shop and buy a mug or whatever. So I mean, that's a certain kind of webcomic, and some people have consumed and still read long ongoing serials in that form, or kind of more one-off type of gag comics. At the same time, there are all these other areas online where comics pop up. I think in the first volume that I worked on, we ran Sam Alden's Hawaii 1997, which was a piece that may have appeared in some form as a mini comic, but that most people, myself included, saw on Tumblr. And when I was starting work on the series, it seemed like Tumblr was a really vital place where people were posting comics and that had certain affordances. Something like that Sam Alden piece, for example, lent itself very well to the kind of web-based scrolling of Tumblr, as opposed to the more horizontal format of the web comic strips that had been more common before that. Now Tumblr doesn't seem to have as much energy as a platform. Some people are starting to post comics on Instagram. Michael DeForge and Angela Chen and some other people. I've read entire short comics on Instagram. But then in the middle of all that, so much media has moved to online platforms. A lot of things that used to be print magazines are now principally web magazines that also have a print component, it seems sometimes. And then there are a lot of other web magazines that don't have a print component at all. There are places like, ranging from, the New Yorker to Spiral Bound to the Nib to Vice online that run a lot of comics. I find those useful because they're at least aggregators of some kind.
Sure.
And I think that's helpful for me. So, for example, we do have work by Julian Glander in this book from his series Susan Something that ran on Vice's website. But I think in probably almost every volume we've had material that originally published online. We also have a piece in here by Ariel Schrag, a 2-page piece that she did for a magazine, I guess, published by Columbia University, or it might just be an online magazine. I'm not even sure if there is a print component. But anyway, that appeared online as a 2-page comic, and we run it in the book as 2 pages. Anyway, I feel like I'm digressing a little bit, but it's a very hard field, certainly, to get your arms around while simultaneously tracking the graphic novels and the small press stuff and everything like that. So I do my best. I do lean maybe a little more heavily on some of the aggregator type sites that I was referring to, because it's helpful, but also because I do know that a lot of artists whose work I'd normally be tracking otherwise have tended to do work for those sites. So I feel like there's a kind of editorial perspective there that I can at least attend to and maybe find something fruitful within. And beyond that, I think I just I do get a lot of email submissions to online comics too. I mean, the submission component is still active there. A lot of people send me links to online websites or PDFs of their online comics and things like that. So just through that activity alone, I do get to see a lot of material that was first published online also.
And the fact that Best American Comics is a print edition, are there comics that work solely as web that you're like, wow, this is great. Unfortunately, I can't think of any way we would put this into a printed page.
It's
not just animation, but like structure.
Well, there are certainly comics I've seen that I've found interesting, but that I felt like were just probably impossible to translate to print. I'm trying to think of a good example of something that we had to adapt from the web that presented some challenges, but I'm not landing on anything right now.
Some of Lauren Weinstein's stuff was sort of geared for the vertical scrolling aspect. It doesn't translate as well to panel by panel.
It's an issue. It's an issue. It's a kind of interesting issue too. I was actually just talking to my students about this the other day. In a way, I feel like the development of online comics has often been held back by the economics of online comics, which is to say, as you may have noticed, it's very difficult to make a living putting stuff on the internet for free.
I just took my Patreon payout for the year.
Okay. Because
I like to do that in December because it's small enough that if I did it every month, I'd feel worse about myself.
Okay.
But yeah, go on.
Yeah. So, and I think as a result, a lot of comics that have been published online have been designed in such a way that one could collect them into a print edition at some point. And I think the economics of it have kind of discouraged without maybe people feeling discouraged, but I think have had the effect of discouraging maybe more aggressive experimentation with what one could do uniquely online. I think that's changing a little bit, in part because some online platforms, online magazines, things like that, have commissioned people to make work for them. And those artists have been interested in exploring some of the things that one can do online, comics that are really long scrolling pieces like you were just describing, or things that incorporate.
Gravett also mentioned that fall of last year when I recorded with him, that apparently in South Korea, you can get by as a web cartoonist just doing, tablet or phone type comics that are not going to exist in print under any circumstance. But, I assume the economics are a little different there than here, or at least publishers might be, willing to subsidize that sort of stuff.
Yeah, that's a whole genre of a Korean phone based comic that I have seen, and I've had students show me that work too, where it's basically a long scroll of one panel following another. I don't know to what extent they take advantage of that scrolling formally in terms of changing the size and shape of the panels and things like that. And it's been interesting to observe artists who are kind of occupying that in-between space, like Emily Carroll, for example, is someone who has made some work that really effectively takes advantage of the possibilities of what you can do online. That work has also been translated into print. But it definitely, when you look at the print version of some of the online, but not all of the online, but some of the online pieces, you can see that there's some compromise that has to be made in order to make that work in book form. Actually, one example that I'm thinking of now from the very first volume that I worked on with Scott McCloud was Hyperbole and a Half by Ali Broche.
Oh, sure.
We ran an excerpt from Depression Part 2. And, that was something that was hugely visible at the time that it was posted as an online comic. It's sort of straddling the format between comics and blogging. And there was a print edition of that work that came out right around the time that we were putting together our book. So that did provide a already sort of reconfigured version of that for us to work with, so that we didn't have to basically figure anything else out because someone at the publisher had already figured it out while we were in the middle of working on our thing. So that was helpful. But definitely I also feel that work functions best online. where Ali Broche was able to really dramatically vary the images, the height, the width, the size of the images, so that they could have different kinds of valences. Whereas in the book, everything got kind of squeezed into this much more typical digest-sized book format for obvious reasons. But anyway, so that's an interesting thing. Every now and then I do see something where, the scrolling or the use of animated GIFs or something like that makes it, difficult to imagine how it could be reconfigured for print in a way that would represent the strengths of the work well. I think that's sort of the question for me, because I think you could probably find a way to represent almost anything in print if you're willing to reconfigure it. But the question is, are you losing what makes the experience of reading that powerful and pleasurable? And that's something that I think we have to think about on a case-by-case basis.
And talk about teaching.
Yes.
What do you teach, and how have the students changed over the years you've been doing this?
Let's see. I've been teaching since 2008. I mainly teach at Parsons. I teach classes on comics and graphic novels. I've also taught history of illustration and some other things. But mainly I teach a course called Reading Graphic Novels, which is structured like a literature course, but we read comics. And another class that's a first-year class called Comics Theory and Practice, where I have students actually making comics. I also co-teach a History of Visual Storytelling class in the summer at SVA in their MFA Visual Narrative program with Leonard Marcus, who you may know is a real leading expert on children's books, has written several books in that area. And so we kind of co-teach this History of Visual Storytelling class where he talks about the history of picture books and I talk about the history of comics. So I enjoy teaching a lot. I think there's nothing better than a situation that forces you to communicate clearly.
And that's what I usually ask guys. What did you learn in the process of teaching?
Yeah.
Like, what did you have to figure out that you may have known but didn't know you knew until you got in front of a class full of students?
Well, I think sometimes you just think that certain ideas are very clear in your own head until you start to try to explain them to someone else.
Expressions.
And it's and I mean, in the process, not only do you learn how to communicate more clearly, but you kind of untangle the knots in your own thinking too. The things that maybe you've left vague because you think you've got it nailed, but you realize you're talking to students. But at the same time, there's feedback too. I think on a year-to-year basis, you can never feel 100% secure that you've nailed it and you've got it and you know what you're doing, because every time you start a new class, there's a different group of human beings in the room, and they're going to respond to what you say in different ways and bring different experiences to the classroom. They're going to respond to the work that you're reading differently. So kind of, in a way, kind of like what I was saying about the strength of doing something like Best American Comics, it's about keeping yourself open to feedback from others. And whether that's artists submitting work or students having reactions to things. And then, of course, there's the actual responsibility of teaching, which is, kind of negotiating, on the one hand, being responsible for creating the conditions for the students to be successful. But on the other hand, students have their responsibilities, too, that they have to hold up. And on the one hand, they're adults. On the other hand, they're students,
in between range.
Just trying to sort of manage all of that stuff is something that it's important to handle responsibly. And it's always kind of appalling to me when I hear about people who don't.
Now, when it comes to the reading graphic novels course, do you have a relatively fixed curriculum? And do you occasionally decide, I'm going to throw a curveball in here and see how the class responds to X?
Yeah, a little bit. I mean, that's an interesting one because we teach a relatively small number of actual graphic novels in the class. There's kind of a core group of about usually 4 or 5 books that we do in the middle of the semester. We go into it reading Understanding Comics and some short form comics that we analyze on our own. And then we kind of move into the core group of graphic novels. And usually, I think probably I'm a little conservative in that regard because I do kind of have a feeling that, if someone's going to take one graphic novel class in their entire education, it's probably good to read a few of the foundational things, like Mouse, for example. But I do switch it up a bit too. This semester, actually, for the first time, I used a book called Citizen 13660 by Mine Okubo. I don't know if you've seen this book.
Nope.
It was written and drawn by a Japanese-American artist about her experience in a Japanese internment camp during World War II. And she was, I don't want to get too deep into the biographical details without the information in front of me. But she was Japanese-American, born in this country. She was a successful art student. She was doing like a residency in France. She had been one of Diego Rivera's assistants. And then World War II broke out in Europe. While she was over there, she managed to get back to the U.S. And then the order came out from FDR and the U.S. government that, the Japanese on the West Coast and Japanese Americans were to be placed in these internment camps. So she started chronicling her experience there in drawings, and she made a book of it. So each page is one drawing with text underneath it. And that book came out shortly after that experience. I think the first edition came out in 1946, but it's still in print, I believe, from University of Washington Press. So anyway, frankly, I mean, I thought of that book because of the horrible things that have been going on at the U.S.-Mexico border, which is not to say it's not always relevant anyway. But so I felt really motivated to introduce that into the syllabus this year for those reasons. And it also seemed, once I thought of it, it also seemed like a really nice follow-up to Mouse, because you sort of see both sides of America during World War II that way in some ways. In the end of Mouse, the American soldiers are the liberators, but then in Citizen 13660, you see the American government putting people into internment camps based on race and ethnicity. And that's something that I think a lot of students maybe didn't know about too. So it's not exactly the goal of the course to teach history through comics, but at the same time, I mean, everything has content, and everything can prompt discussion potentially. So anyway, that was one example of switching things up. Beyond that, once we move past the graphic novels, relevant to this conversation, we actually do use Best American Comics.
I was going to ask.
For a long time, I resisted using Best American Comics in my class because I thought it was really corny for a professor to assign a book with their own name on the cover.
That's what I thought you were
and
hesitant over.
Yeah, but then I sat in on, I did like a kind of like a Skype session with a professor who I know who was using Best American Comics in their class, and he had given the students some assignment of I don't remember the exact way that it was structured, but it was something along the lines of evaluating the book, talking about the contents, and then also sort of putting themselves in the position of the editor and discussing. They each had to, I think, pick one piece that they would not have included if they were the editor, which prompted a pretty interesting discussion. And at the end of this session, I was like, oh, that was really great. I should try that too. And I did something very similar with my students, and it was really good. And what I also found was that, after doing a group of graphic novels that was maybe a little bit more canonical, most of which were at least 10 years old, that it was, I think, good for the students to see this kind of core sample of recent contemporary work that included a range of visual styles and narrative approaches that I think dramatically diversified the range of the course. And then usually after that, we move on to look at online comics. And that gives them another group of, 6 or 8 or so contemporary artists working in very different visual styles to think about as well. So those last couple things that we do towards the end of the semester with Best American Comics and the web comics, I think, really open up the field for them after having spent, about a month and a half, kind of working through some more well-known, well-established graphic novels.
Did you want to make comics when you were a kid?
Yeah, I was just home for Thanksgiving and looking at my very carefully copied pencil drawings of Spider-Man and stuff like that.
What era of Spider-Man would that have been? Because that's too early for McFarlane.
I made a very good copy of the cover of, but just the figure of Spider-Man, the cover of the Secret Wars issue where Spider-Man gets his new costume.
Getting that Mike Zeck.
Yeah. If that dates it for you.
Yeah. That's you're just a little bit younger than me, so yeah. Oh yeah, that was a summer I got bar mitzvah. So yeah, summer of '84. I remember picking up that Spider-Man 252, and because unfortunately we remember all those numbers.
Yeah, it's amazing how burned into our brains that stuff was, but it's because at the time we weren't on the internet and we had our pile of comics and we would read them over and over again.
Yeah. For me, it was the Claremont and Byrne X-Men, because I'm just a little bit older than you. So I was reading those 8, 9, 10 years old, and that kind of warped my brain into Frank Miller doing Daredevil. And that was the... But luckily I survived and turned into a lobbyist. Anyway, programming. You do programming for events like MoCA, used to do SPX.
I've worked on a lot of festivals over the years. I did programming for SPX for I think 9 years, and I co-founded the Brooklyn Comics and Graphics Festival, which ran for 4 years, and I've done the programming for MoCA now for I think 5 years. I think I've done 5 programming schedules for MoCA, and I'll do the coming year, the 2019 programming. I enjoy that. I like public events. I like panels. I like public conversations. I think...
What sort of challenges, though, in terms of, knowing what an audience is going to want to have, making sure it's not a whole bunch of white dudes, Those
are all challenges. I mean, certainly, I'm really grateful that there's so much increased attention to diversity. And I think... I'm working with organizations, and certainly all the organizations and myself are conscious of that and cognizant of that when we're putting together these schedules, these programming schedules. For me, the thing that I like best, which is not necessarily the thing that the audience wants most, is when we can get a kind of odd group of people together to talk about a focused subject that's maybe not so obvious, and then it starts to take off. But I think certainly the easiest thing to do with programming is to just, and it's something that audiences also really like, is to get someone who everyone wants to see and put them on stage with someone in conversation and let them talk as much as possible. And people are hungry for it and want to soak up the opinion and the ideas and the affect of the person who they're a fan of, and then maybe ask a question afterwards.
It's more of a statement than a question. I'm just kidding.
Right. And publishers like that too, if that person's got a new book out and stuff like that. So it's kind of a balance of trying to hit all the beats. I always try to make sure there's room for one or two of the more in the weeds kinds of things that I myself like. But I also know that, if a festival is advertising a guest as a major guest, they're advertising that person because people are going to want to come and see them. And if people are going to come wanting to see that person, we should make sure they have a chance to hear from that person. I mean, I do like to switch it up a little bit and sometimes have, a real headline featured guest in conversation with someone else who might bounce off of them in a way. And one of the values of that too is, some people definitely have their stories that they're sticking to. They have their
trust me, I go through it with this stuff too.
Very kind of they got a
routine. That's
briefcase of anecdotes or whatever. Yeah, however you want to characterize that, which is fine too. I mean, it's everyone's hearing it for the first time. Someone in the room is hearing all that stuff for the first time. But yeah, it's just a question of balancing all the various needs of the events, of making sure that the festival's needs are taken care of, that we're working with the artists who
publishers and everybody
the public wants to come see, that if we have relationships with publishers, we like to make sure everyone feels like their work is being represented somehow as much as possible. Working on MoCA, it's a much tighter schedule than SPX, because SPX is 2 days of programming, 2 rooms running simultaneously for the entire day of the festival, one panel after the other, 1 hour blocks.
Yeah.
And I think when I was doing the SPX programming, we had up to like 22 panels each weekend.
Yeah. And
just planning that was a lot, and then just kind of running those rooms for 2 days was a lot. MoCA is organized by the Society of Illustrators. They have a different approach that they prefer, which has certainly been less just taxing for me, which is that they like to keep it tight. They like to keep it tight and focused. We have 2 rooms running for 2 days, but it's just 3 panels in each room on each of the 2 days. So it's a 12 event programming schedule. And for me, one of the things, even when we're doing the most typical kind of Q&A with a big name guest type of event, which is like the most common thing, one of the things I do like to do as much as possible is to really get the right person to run the Q&A, to ask the questions. And that can mean any number of things. It can be maybe someone unpredictable who might have a different angle on the artist's work, or on the other end, it can be someone who that person has a fantastic rapport with, and that is going to translate well to a good public conversation. So that can take many different forms, but I just kind of want to avoid like someone just sitting up there with like their editor just kind of feeding them softball questions to get
off index cards and
talk about the book, and stuff like that, or just kind of asking sort of rote, so how'd you get started, kind of questions. So I try to at least come up with someone who's got as much as possible a real valid reason to be doing that. Whether it's because they're a super, not supernatural, but extremely natural choice, or because they're an unconventional choice who might bring a very different kind of take to the work than what we usually hear in comics. So, for example, I remember when we had Aileen Kaminsky-Crum at MoCA, I was able to get a curator from MoMA to come and ask her questions, and that was someone who had previously worked with her and Robert and Crum in some other context. So I knew it was someone who was familiar with the work. They weren't going to be coming at it out of the blue, but unquestionably someone who's a MoMA curator is going to ask pretty different questions than someone who's just a kind of dyed-in-the-wool comics insider. So that kind of thing is interesting to me to arrange when it's possible to arrange it.
It's like when CXC had their second year, they had Gary Trudeau being interviewed by Glenn David Gold, who I recorded with earlier this year, but I thought I would not have thought of that. And it may have been Gary's suggestion to fly him in for it, but it was just, okay, I'm sure that guy is going to have a bunch of really good questions for Trudeau. That's going to be a neat combo, instead of somebody who's just going to say, I read Doonesbury since I was a little kid, just
so how did you invent Zonker?
Now tell me about the book you're working on.
I'm currently in the process of writing basically a general history of North American comics for Princeton University Press. It's going to be a pretty big book, physically, and a massive success. It's going to, it's a pretty long book. It kind of aims to really be kind of in some ways, kind of a 101 book to the history of North American comics, but one that's not afraid to get into the nitty-gritty in various kinds of ways. I don't want it to be simplistic or oversimplified. I want it to present a really informed take on the history of North American comics. It also, even though it's specifically focused on North American comics, but that also takes into account the international influence that goes both ways. American comics are influenced by international comics are influenced by American comics, and that doesn't shy away from, making some tough choices, both in terms of aesthetic terms and in terms of cultural history about what's going to be in the book, because I don't want it to just be like a parade of pop culture's greatest hits.
Sure.
So, it's informed by my perspective, but it's a perspective that I if the book is well done, will have validity and integrity to it. And it won't be someone else's perspective, but it'll be a valid perspective and a walk through this not very long compared to other forms, but still very dense and complicated modern cultural and aesthetic history in a way that negotiates, I think, and has to negotiate both the aesthetic side of the form and the cultural history part of it, because you're basically talking, for the most part, about art that was created within the context of mass media. Mm-hmm. So there's a lot of cultural push-pull there.
And I think of Eddie Campbell's recent book, The Goat Getters, where we talked about it last September, where it was him explaining the disclaimer and the way he had to phrase it in terms of what was, mass culture back then and what was acceptable versus what a contemporary audience would freak out overseeing.
That's certainly an issue when you're looking at the history of any kind of popular culture in the 20th century, 19th, 20th. I mean, even further back, I'm sure. But also, I mean, part of what I'm doing too in the book, I'm not just avoiding the parade of, Macy's balloons, that you might see in other comics histories, but I am also looking a lot at other presses. For example, right now I'm in the middle of writing about comic strips during World War II, and sure, you can talk about like Milton Caniff and stuff like that, but Ollie Harrington was drawing a comic strip about African American airmen called Jive Gray for the Black Press. The Daily Worker was running a kind of left-wing comic strip, as was PM. So I mean, there are other presses. There are alternatives. There are alternative histories that haven't always been incorporated in previous narratives of comics history, that to me are just as important to include in this book as, Terry and the Pirates or something like that.
Yeah, and how well preserved are those in terms of archives?
The materials?
Yeah.
Some better than others. I mean, to be honest, with some of this material, including a lot of what I was just talking about, you'd probably have to hit the microfilm if you really wanted to read it. Fortunately, there's been some scholarship about that material over the last several years, that at least opens a door to it. So it's possible to know what it is and to talk about it. But certainly as much as possible, when I'm writing about this stuff, I like to at least dip into and sample that material. And for that work, I'm certainly going to have to hit the microfilm, I think.
I'm just thinking in terms of luck, citing yet another episode, Eddie Portnoy, the guy who did Bad Rabbis, the collection of tabloid Yiddish culture. It was luck that led to a lot of those papers being preserved from Eastern Europe into the U.S. before the war ends up wiping out all that culture. I was just wondering how much of those things, at least knowing that there is a source somewhere, even if it's not, the physical paper itself, for the Daily Worker, for the black presses and things like that. So.
Yeah. I mean, there are archives,
yeah.
And here in New York, we have the Tamman Archive at NYU Library, and there are others around New York Historical Society, etc.
Last official question. What do you tell your family members that you do? When they ask, so what do you do for a living? And if you say comics and they ask if you're going to the Aquaman movie, that's do you have a lot of explaining to do at this point?
Yeah, I mean, they sort of, they don't have deep familiarity with the material that I'm working with. But they see Best American Comics every year, so that gives them a glimpse into what I'm working with. And, they know that I edit this book and that I teach and that I've done some events. And
so they don't think this is all made up. That's what I'm making sure. Just older generation might think, comic books, how could you make a living doing, that's...
Well, I think that's what they thought until I managed to hammer together a living. But, what can I say? And at this point, I think, in the past, they would have encouraged me to maybe go to law school or something like that, but it's too late for that now.
Nice. Bill, thanks so much for coming on the show.
All right. Thanks for having me.
Oh, and since it's the guest list episode, here are Bill's faves from 2018.
I don't know if I have one favorite thing that I read in 2018.
It could be a couple.
Okay.
What jumps to mind?
Well, I think the Chicago-based Rizzo publisher, Perfectly Acceptable Press, published a couple of really great comics this past year. One was Grip by Lolly Westfind, who did the cover of the Best American Comics 2018, but her new book, Grip, Volume 1, is exactly the kind of thing you like to see, just in terms of someone taking all the good stuff that they've done and sort of resynthesizing it and making something really strong. They also published a book by Margot Ferrick called Dog Nurse that I really liked. Margot Ferrick also, coincidentally, has a piece in Best American Comics 2018, which is from her previous book, Yours. So those were both... I thought really good comics, and in both cases they were beautifully printed books, and both represented, I thought, two very exciting younger artists making work that really felt like a kind of synthesis of everything they'd done before to produce a new strong statement. And in both cases the work was moving and meaningful beyond just tracking someone's progress or something like that.
Cool. Goals for 2019? Anyone you plan on reading?
My goal? In reading.
Yeah. Not for writing your book, but,
Yeah, I was going to say, I want to finish. I'd like to read the manuscript of my book when it's finished. That's what I'd like to read more than anything, because I am planning to finish that this year. In terms of things that I want to read myself, I have a book, a novel that's just been sitting around for months by a French writer called Pierre Mac-Orlan, called Mademoiselle Bambou, and I actually don't know a whole lot about it, but I came across some information about Mac-Orlan, and he just seems like a really fascinating figure, and I believe this is the only novel of his that's been published in English. He was one of these early 20th century avant-gardists who did kind of everything from, writing songs for singers to... apparently dabbling in, or maybe working a lot, I still don't know, in spanking themed bondage-y pornography, and also drew some important and significant early French comics, among other activities. But apparently he also wrote a huge body of pulp novels, as well as some more maybe high-minded or, personally ambitious novels. Yeah. So I actually don't have my arms around this character's biography at all, but it just seems like one of these really interesting, early 20th century avant-garde type figures. And I, had come across his work through my research into French comics, and, just on a lark, I checked to see if he had anything in English, found this novel, and it's just been kind of sitting around reproachfully looking at me as I've been reading Best American Comics submissions and reading research material for my book project.
Cool. I hope you're able to get to it in 2019.
I think so. I think I'll manage it.
Cool. Thanks, Bill.
Thank you.
And that was Bill Kartalopoulos. The 2018 edition of the Best American Comics series is out now, guest edited by past podcast Phoebe Gleckner, and published by Houghton Mifflin Harcourt. It's got an amazing selection of comics and turned me on to all sorts of works I wouldn't have come across on my own. So check out that one and past editions. Follow Bill on Twitter at BKNY, and check out his site onpanel.com for more of his writing, events, and leads on other great comics. And that's on-panel.com. Now, after we wrapped, I asked Bill, so, who you reading? If you want to hear his answer to that, you'll need to become a supporter of the Virtual Memories Show so you can get access to our quarterly bonus podcast, Fear of a Square Planet. The third quarter episode features book recommendations and some extra conversation with Moby, Audrey Niffenegger, Mark Ulrichsen, David Lloyd, Glenn David Gold, Ken Crimstein, Hal Mayforth, Lance Richardson, and Nathaniel Popkin. You can support the Virtual Memories Show via patreon.com/VMSpod or paypal.me/VMSpod. I've got all sorts of goals and goodies in place for patrons, including that podcast, patron-only blog, handwritten show notes for every episode, my secret project, and more. So go to patreon.com/VMSpod and support the art of fine conversation. Now, I recorded this part of the episode at Bill's apartment in Brooklyn, so there were tolls on the GW and Triborough, RFK, whatever, but I did find street parking, so yay. It was part of a double-episode trip to New York City this weekend, as I also recorded with Edmund White later in the day. That episode will come up in January, but that didn't make it any easier. I did find street parking in Chelsea for the session with Edmund, too, so at least I saved on that. Still, if you want to help defray some of the costs of the Virtual Memories Show, like web hosting, travel, equipment, coffee, or just toss me some money because you think the show is worth it, then visit patreon.com/VMSpod or paypal.me/VMSpod and make a one-time or recurring donation. Special thanks go out to Joe Caruso, Michael Hacker, Michael Janizik, Paul Karasik, Fred Kish, Jonathan Kranz, Jack Les Camella, Teresa Lewis, Stephen Nadler, Jim Ottaviani, Payne Prophet, Dmitry Samarov, Stephen Solomon, Craig P. Steffen, Greg Tanner, Ford Thomas, Noah Van Skyver, and Garrett Zecker for going over and above in their support of the Virtual Memories Show. We have the full list of show supporters at chimeraobscura.com/VM. Our music for this episode is Fella by Hal Mayforth, used with permission from the artist. And that's it for this week's episode of the Virtual Memories Show. Thanks so much for listening. We'll be back next week with our 300th episode. It's got a super special guest I've been trying to get for 6 years now, and I'm not going to tell you who it is. You got to come back next week to find out. Now, you can subscribe to the Virtual Memories Show and download past episodes at the iTunes Store. You can also find all our episodes and get on our email list at either of our websites, vmspod.com or chimeraobscura.com/VM. You can also follow the Virtual Memories Show on Twitter and Instagram at VMSpod, at virtualmemoriespodcast.tumblr.com, and on YouTube, Spotify, and TuneIn.com by searching for Virtual Memories Show. And if you like this podcast, please go to iTunes, look up the Virtual Memories Show, and leave a rating and maybe a review for us. That'll help us build a bigger audience. You've been listening to the Virtual Memories Show. I'm your host, Gil Roth, and you are awesome. Keep it that way.